Thank you. I see by the clocks on the wall we have 8:15 on one and we have 2 o'clock on the other, so if we split the difference, that means it's 7 o'clock and time to get started. Welcome everybody and good evening. My name is Dave McGee and I am the Dean of Science here at UNB. On behalf of the Faculty of Science, I am pleased but not surprised that we have been able to fill this auditorium for tonight's public lecture on physician-assisted dying. I would like to clarify that we are hosting this event not with the intention to promote either the pros or cons of the legalization of physician-assisted dying, but simply to hear the facts. Trust me, I know firsthand how emotional these decisions can be. But as we have all heard many times in the proverbial adage, death and taxes are inevitable, and we need to be prepared for both. To attempt to some humor with a political theme that seems to be emerging with the upcoming election, when it comes time to planning for death and taxes, I'm just not ready. As part of the academic community at UNB, we strive to educate students to the best of our ability with a variety of methods and resources. Tonight, the best resource is an alumnus of UNB Science, Dr. Jeff Blackmer. Jeff is the Vice President of Medical Professionalism with the Canadian Medical Association. Dr. Blackmer has been at the forefront of this controversial topic and instrumental in striking a balance between the legality and the humanity for Canadians while recognizing and appreciating the varying views we may have as individuals and as members of society. Perhaps after tonight's lecture, our personal views may be reaffirmed or perhaps influenced into another direction. That's what information does and should do. Provide us with a mechanism to make informed decisions. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jeff Blackmer to the podium.
Thank you. Hi. How are you guys? Good. I'm good, thanks. So I want to say a big thank you to Dave and to Anna and the rest of the team for inviting me here tonight. This was an idea that has been many months in the making, and it's great to see it come off so successfully. And thank you so much to all of you for taking time out of what's a really glorious Fredericton evening to attend. I'm not only a proud alumnus of UNB, but a proud native of Fredericton and FHS class of '80. And it's great to be home as well. And I've been really honored to be able to speak to a lot of different audiences in a lot of different places. And I have to say that this one really means an awful lot. So thank you for the invitation. Thank you. And thank you to all my friends who are here, my family, my parents are here, and cousins from St. Stephen, and it really, again, means a lot that people have come to support me. And, I've been really lucky to be invited all over Canada giving talks on this issue. It's something that I spent a long time thinking about, and every place I go, people say, wow, this is the biggest crowd that we ever had. We usually get like 10 people to one of these meetings. We had like 200 tonight, and I say, yeah, it was totally me, and of course it's totally not me. Right? Has nothing to do, I mean, my parents are here because of me. They might not have come otherwise, but all the rest of you would be here because this is a topic that's a very difficult one, and I think people want to hear about it. They want to have a chance to talk about it, and one of the things that's been very gratifying for me is that as I've had a chance to discuss this with people, they say to me at the time or later on, that was great because it gave me sort of that opening to go home and talk about this with my family, and I probably wouldn't have done that otherwise, and it gave me an opportunity to tell people what I would want done in these types of situations. So I think as Dr. McGee said, the whole reason for tonight is sort of as an exercise to hear where we are now, but to reflect for ourselves what we think about this and what it means to us as individuals and as Canadians. So I'm going to talk about physician-assisted dying and what I would say is a very rapidly evolving Canadian landscape. In fact, I have to sort of monitor things closely every day because on more than one occasion, I've had to change my talk a few minutes before I've gone on stage because something has happened that day that's made me have to change my slide. So nothing today, thankfully, but who knows about tomorrow. So what I'm going to do is provide you with a bit of an update on the current legal landscape, and I'm going to briefly run through some of the cases that have really kind of brought this to the forefront and are the reason that we're having to confront this in such a timely way right now. I'm going to talk a bit about what I and the CMA have been doing in terms of representing Canadian physicians and trying to influence this process as well. And we'd like to think that we played a bit of a role in advancing the agenda here. And then I'm going to finish by talking about what comes next. So here we are, we're September 23rd. We've got a deadline of February 6th, which is looming pretty close. We've got a few things that are in play. What's going to happen over the next few months and how do I see things evolving? And then I'm going to leave lots of time for questions and discussion at the end because that's often really the best part of all of this. So here's a headline from Canada's national medical journal, the Globe and Mail. And this is, actually Chatelaine is the national medical journal. This is like the second place national medical journal. And so this is from June of last year. And this was one of those circumstances where I was just about to give a talk to the Ottawa Academy of Medicine on this topic at 6 p.m. and at late in the afternoon, Quebec came out with this new legislation and we were all sort of waiting to see how the vote would go. And they passed what's called Bill 52, an act respecting care at the end of life. And so they became really the first province to come out with something in this area. And I'm going to unpack that a little bit and talk about how that's similar and different to what the Supreme Court has said. And so here's a second headline from February the 6th of this year. Says Supreme Court rules that Canadians have the right to doctor-assisted suicide. And this was a pretty monumental day in this country, regardless of how you feel about the issue. It really struck home with a lot of people. Does anyone know who this is? Sue Rodriguez. So this is great because yesterday I gave a lecture to first-year medical students who are all, by the way, 11 years old. And I said, who's Sue Rodriguez? And they went, 1993? What are you taught in 1993? That's forever ago. Who's Sue Rodriguez? So who's Sue Rodriguez? ALS. Where did Sue Rodriguez live? BC. Because everyone who has a case appearing before the Supreme Court is from BC, as I will show you conclusively. So Sue Rodriguez was a young woman who in 1992 was diagnosed with ALS, which is Lou Gehrig's disease. And she went through the court system in BC and all the way to the Supreme Court with a very novel argument that was actually quite groundbreaking at the time. And her argument was suicide is actually legal in Canada. Now, it didn't used to be until a few decades ago. Suicide was illegal. And so, in fact, if you tried to kill yourself and you were unsuccessful, you could be put in jail. And then the government said, this is not good suicide prevention strategy. We should try something else. And so they took that law off the books. And what Sue Rodriguez said was, look, for able-bodied people, it's legal for them to kill themselves, right? But I either cannot right now, or I will not be able to in the future by virtue of my disability. And keep in mind, this was relatively early in the history of the repatriation of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And she said, my disability is impeding me from doing something that's legal for everyone else. Not having access to assisted suicide is a breach of my charter rights. And no one had really heard this before, and people said, I wonder if she has a point. And so it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and people thought the Supreme Court would really dismiss this out of hand because this was very early in the assisted dying debate. There weren't very many countries that were doing this. We didn't have a whole lot of experience. And the court said 5-4 in a 5-4 split decision that you do not have that right and that the laws are not unconstitutional. But it was a very close vote. And what they said was, yes, it is a breach of your charter rights, but it's a justifiable breach because charter rights are not absolute. And they said it's justified based on the fact that in Canadian society, life is sacrosanct. and we hold life to be important above all. So even though we are preventing you from doing something that may be legal, we cannot condone having someone else assist you with this because of Canadian values. And they went on to say, also, we don't really have any experience with this, so we don't have anything that tells us that we can craft laws or regulations that will prevent abuse of this type of a scenario. And until we know more about it, we don't feel comfortable with making this legal. And so they ruled against her in a 5-4 decision. And two things about that are notable. First of all, Beverly McLaughlin, who is now the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, is the only remaining justice from that decision. And she voted with the minority. So she was one of the 4 who voted in favor of Rodriguez. And the other interesting thing is that this continued, Sue Rodriguez continued to be in the news and continued to be a controversial figure when she actually did subsequently avail herself of assisted suicide with the help of Sven Robinson, who some of you may remember as an NDP member of Parliament. And so the debate really flared at that time. It settled for a few years. We had a few Senate committees look at this. We had, the odd sort of case that made the media, but it didn't really come back into the Canadian conscience in a huge way until recently, when we had what's called the Carter case. So the Carter case was another constitutional challenge of the Criminal Code section that makes physician-assisted dying illegal in Canada. And it was brought forward by the BC Civil Liberties Association as well as a group of individuals. And these individuals included Lee Carter and Hollis Johnson. And Lee and Hollis, who I've since met, traveled to Switzerland to assist Lee's mother Kay in obtaining physician-assisted suicide. So there's a picture of Switzerland, which looks nice and bucolic, and that's actually how it looks. Some of you may know Switzerland has very, very liberal assisted suicide laws. In fact, the most liberal in the world. So all the other jurisdictions have some sort of a residency requirement. So you have to go, become a resident, get your health card, and then you can avail yourself of assisted dying. But in Switzerland, there's no such requirement. And so there's a couple of organizations that assist with this type of thing, and you can basically fly to Switzerland on a Tuesday and have assisted suicide on a Wednesday for almost any reason. And there's people who sort of flippantly call it suicide tourism. And Canada, believe it or not, is the number 7 or 8 most common country for people to go to Switzerland. Much more common in Europe. We just don't hear about this very often, so it's not something that people talk about. But Lee and Hollis basically said, look, this is legal in Switzerland. We had to leave Canada, spend tens of thousands of dollars, leave our family and loved ones to do something that we think we should have a right to here in Canada. And so they were one of the main appellants in this case. And then Gloria Taylor, who some of you may remember as being more sort of the face of this issue if you've been following it, like Sue Rodriguez before her, suffered from ALS, also from Vancouver, and she made exactly the same argument that her charter rights were infringed by legislation preventing her from getting assistance for suicide on the basis of her disability. So the same argument that Sue Rodriguez made exactly 20 years before. So this went to the BC Supreme Court, and Madame Justice Lynn Smith ruled that the Criminal Code provisions indeed did unjustifiably infringe the equality rights of the plaintiffs in this case. And I want to make the point that she really did her homework. So I spoke to her a couple of times, and I put her in touch with some of my colleagues internationally, and she went through all the literature from all the jurisdictions where assisted dying is legalized, and she parsed the statistics, and she really gave this a lot of thought. And she basically said, the Supreme Court ruled on this 20 years ago, but they didn't have the information that we have now. They didn't know what we know now. They don't have all these studies from places like Belgium and Holland that she thought sort of showed that we could craft something that wouldn't be subject to abuse. And so she said, times have changed, the Canadian public has changed. They said back then it was unconstitutional, but justifiably, and she said, I no longer find that it's justifiable. And so she ruled in favor of Carter, and she gave Parliament 1 year to take whatever steps it sees fit to draft and consider legislation. And that's pretty common in this type of situation, where they basically suspend the ruling for a year to let people get their house in order. And she also granted Gloria a constitutional exemption during the period. So that for a very short period of time, she was the only person in Canada who could legally have availed herself of assisted suicide, and she actually died of a bowel infection a short time later without needing access to assistance in dying. And interestingly, this went to the BC Court of Appeal. So that's sort of the ladder in the court system. It goes from their Supreme Court to their Court of Appeals. And they overturned the British Columbia Supreme Court decision. And it's 3 justices. And 2 of them said, essentially, this has already been decided in the Rodriguez decision. We've already heard this. We've already ruled on it from a judicial standpoint. There's actually no real law that says that Supreme Court decisions have to influence every other subsequent decision. It's a little bit different than it is in the US, although there's obviously always a lot of deference to Supreme Court decisions. But they said, look, 2 of us feel that we've already heard this, and that even though some of the, we may have different evidence, the facts haven't really changed. And so Carter and lawyers decided to appeal this to the Supreme Court of Canada. Now, the Supreme Court doesn't have to agree to hear cases. They don't have to give any reasons why they will or will not hear cases, but we all sort of thought they were probably going to hear this one, and certainly that's exactly what they agreed to do. So this hearing took place on October the 15th, 2014, so almost a year ago, and the CMA was granted leave to appear as what's called a friend of the court. And a friend of the court basically means that we're there not to argue for a change in legislation or against a change in legislation. We're there to present information. And I want to make it really clear to people tonight, especially those of you who may or may not have brought protest signs or tomatoes or anything like that, that I'm not here arguing for or against a change in legislation. What the CMA has done is said, look, this is up to society. Right? This is not up to doctors to decide if this is going to be legalized. Why would we leave that up to doctors? This is up to society. And we hoped it would be through elected representatives. Instead, it's been through a court. We respect that. And we respect and support our members on either side of this issue. So for doctors who decide they want to participate, we'll support them and we'll try and give them the tools that they need to do a good job in that. And for doctors who say, this is against my own personal moral views, we will protect them and we will protect their right not to participate. So we were really a neutral body there to present information. How many of you have been to the Supreme Court in Ottawa? Okay, so quite a few. It's a nice building. How many of you guys have been into the main chambers where they hear the cases? Yeah, so most of you have been inside there. So this was fascinating for me because I'd been to the Supreme Court before, but never inside chambers. And you can see up on top there, that's the sort of the rotunda when you come in. And it's so massively impressive with these giant columns. And I live in Ottawa, and I thank you all for your tax support for my beautiful city. Your taxes really go to make things like this large and impressive and very judicial looking. And then you can see the door sort of up at the top in the middle. That goes into this little itty bitty tiny room, which is actually the chamber where they hear the cases. And you can see at the front of the room where the justices sit up top. And I was really looking forward to the powdered wigs, but they don't do that anymore, unfortunately. So it's a very small room, and essentially they really only have a place for the lawyers and the appellants. And there were a lot of interveners, a lot of lawyers in this case. And we only got 2 tickets to sit and watch this, and then the rest of it sort of based on first come, first serve. So we gave our ticket. We were very nice. We gave our ticket to the president and the president-elect, and myself and our chief legal counsel went and stood out in the rain at 5 in the morning with Tim Hortons, waiting for them to open the doors. And of course, you can't bring an umbrella into the Supreme Court. So we were very wet by the time we got in. But we did get a seat, and I was really glad we did because it was an incredible experience. It felt like history in the making. And I talked to some of the clerks afterwards and some of the people who go to these, and they said, oh yeah, this was completely different. We've never seen anything like it. And even some of the justices off the record have said, this is almost certainly the most important decision this court will ever make in its history, no matter how long that history runs. And the reason for that is This impacts every single Canadian, potentially, and very few of the court's decisions have the power or the potential to impact every single Canadian. Because as Dr. McGee says, bad news, we're all going to die. So what we wanted to tell the court was a number of things. So here were some of our key points. So our current policy says that we will, as a representative body, we represent 80,000, actually it's 81,400 and something doctors across Canada. We'll support our members on all sides of this issue. We will support them whatever they decide. We also noted that the profession, just like the public, is very much divided on this issue. We are far from unified. We talked a little bit as well about some of the practical considerations. So I'm going to briefly talk about some of the work that we did leading up to all this, but one of the things we did is we put me on a plane and we sent me all around the country to talk to the public and to doctors and to hear what people had to say about this. Not to tell them anything, but just sit and listen to them, which is really sort of novel when you think about it. And we had one of these here in Fredericton, and I went and I listened to doctors talk about this, and one of the psychiatrists said, you know, I spend all my day doing capacity assessments. All I do is trying to determine if people are capable of making decisions. Do they have the mental faculties to allow them to say they want this treatment or that treatment? He said, can you imagine when this becomes legalized, I won't have capacity to do capacity assessments and I'll go insane and my colleagues will have to commit me. And I thought about it, I said, you know what, he's right. I mean, we just sort of take it for granted that someone's going to do these and it's all going to work out. And yet we don't even have the ability to do these now in the system. So how are we going to, you know, when it's literally life and death, a lot of people are going to want a psychiatrist to weigh in on this, and we don't have that bandwidth. And when I did one of these discussions in Vancouver at the British Columbia Medical Association, and one of the palliative care doctors took me aside after and said, you know, I don't want to be flip about it at all, but people are hard to kill. And they really are. And, you know, I talk to medical students and residents and they go, yeah, people survive anything. I mean, you can't believe, you know, what human beings can tolerate and still come out the other side. It's incredible. And you don't have to look any further than some of the experiences we've had in the US lately, right? So you look at what's happened with some of the capital punishment cases there when they've tried to put prisoners to death and they've survived for hours and hours and hours in horrible agony because they haven't used the right medication or combination of medications. So there's some really important technical considerations here as well. I mean, think about it. This is the first intervention in thousands of years that is just being foisted on the medical profession, and no one has ever learned it. No one knows how to do this in Canada. And I spoke to these first-year medical students yesterday, and I said, look, you guys are going to be the first cadre of people who are going to go through the system with this as a reality. But for me and my colleagues, we went through the system saying, thou shalt not kill. And we weren't going to talk about how we were going to do it because we weren't going to do it. And now we've got to teach thousands of doctors how to do this. And it's not easy. And I'm not trying to sort of be funny about this. It's a real issue. And one thing that is funny, though, is that a few months ago, somehow, and I have no idea how he got my email, you guys remember Jack Kevorkian, right? Down in the US, used to travel around in the van with his machine in the back. So I got an email from his assistant, whose name I wish was Igor, but is not. And he said, yeah, I see you guys are thinking about having assisted dying up in Canada. Let me share Jack's recipe with you. And Jack has long since passed on. But I backed slowly away from my computer and I said, whoa, that is one recipe I don't want to even look at. But I did save it in a file, just in case. I never wrote him back. We also highlighted the fact that, and these are critical points. These are critical points. End-of-life discussions between physicians and their patients need to be supported and need to become part of routine medical practice. And I hear this again and again from my colleagues. It is so much easier if you are in the ICU and you have someone who's dying It is so much easier to put them on a ventilator and go on to the next patient than it is to sit down for 3 hours with the family and have a discussion that, by the way, you won't get paid for. That's an aside, but that's 3 hours out of the time that you could spend with other patients. So we don't have a system in place that allows for these types of things. We don't have the capacity to have these complex conversations with patients and their families, and we need that. If we're going to have assisted dying, we need to have everything that goes along with that so that that's our last resort, right? That's not the first thing that we turn to. And along those same lines, we need a palliative and end-of-life strategy immediately. So depending on how you parse the numbers, only about 20% of Canadians have access to high-quality palliative care services. Let me let that sink in for a second. 20%. If I stood up here tonight and said only 20% of Canadians have access to coronary bypass surgery or renal dialysis, there'd be riots. Well, maybe not in Fredericton, but in other places, Fredericton's very easygoing. In other places, there would be riots, right? This is completely unacceptable because even though not everyone's going to need bypass surgery or renal dialysis, we're all going to die, and most of us would benefit from palliative care, and yet it is not available. And here we are talking about assisted dying, and we haven't even solved the palliative care piece. And the irony is not lost on me that I spent all this time traveling around talking about assisted dying when that really is going to impact about 1% or less of Canadians. That's what we're thinking. About 1% or less will actually avail themselves of assisted dying. I should be spending all my time talking about palliative care and getting people all riled up about that. Thank you. But no one wants to listen except these guys. But it's true. And I want you to know that the CMA is not losing sight of that. So we just recently released a major report, again calling on the federal government to support a national palliative care strategy, which again fell on deaf ears. But we will not give up that fight. So I want to emphasize the importance of these things existing together. So the Supreme Court ruling came down on February the 6th of this year. And this was fascinating. So one of the things I've been exposed to through my work at the CMA is Budget Day, which is unquestionably the most boring day in Canada on the Canadian calendar, when they release the budget and no one cares except for people in Ottawa. But what they do, which is very interesting, is they have what's called a lockdown. And so I send a member of my staff every year, and they go down to Parliament Hill, and they lock them in this room, and they give them a copy of the budget. And all the reporters are there, and they take away their cell phones and their computers, and they have an hour to read through the budget, and then they come out after and they run. It's just like a movie. Well, they used to run to the payphones. Now they just step outside and turn on their cell phone. But you get the picture, and then they file their reports. They've never done that for the Supreme Court before until now. And so they actually had a lockdown the day that they released this. So we sent our chief lawyer to go down to Parliament Hill, and she was locked in a room with all these other people, and she was given the decision at 9 a.m., and the rest of us were waiting back at the CMA around this little teleconference unit, sort of refreshing our iPhones and waiting for the call. And then, of course, at 10 a.m. the call came. And none of us, I just want to say, none of us were surprised, because this was really fast. October to February for the Supreme Court, that's like lightning speed for the Supreme Court, right? And in the room, you could easily see which way the winds were blowing. I mean, they were, I don't know how many of you followed the Tom Brady case. Anyone follow the Tom Brady case? Come on, you followed the Tom Brady case. So just like they were pounding the NFL in the Tom Brady case, right? The justices were pounding the government, saying, how can you let these people suffer, right? How is it that you have laws that mean people kill themselves months sooner than they would otherwise if they had access to this intervention? So we all could sort of see which way it's going, and yet even still, we were surprised by the wording and by, I guess, the way that the court actually signed the document wasn't, usually it's signed all the justices, and it was a unanimous decision. They signed it the court, which is very unusual and shows a very high degree of unanimity. So they held that the appeal should be allowed, meaning that the relevant sections of the criminal code do unjustifiably infringe Section 7 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And here's some very important words in the decision. And this is something that I've spent a lot of time parsing and thinking about. And this is really what it says in terms of who's going to qualify. So it says, they are of no force, so the provisions of the criminal code are of no force to the extent that they prohibit this death for a competent adult person. So let's think about that for a second. So this person actually has to be competent at the time they make the request as well as at the time of assisted dying. What this means is that you cannot put in a living will, if I become incompetent or I develop Alzheimer's or something happens, I want someone to put me to death. You can do that in the Netherlands, but you won't be able to do that in Canada. It also says adult person. So what does federal law tell us an adult person is? Federal law tells us nothing. It's totally silent. The only province with legislation in this area is Quebec, which tells us that an adult person is 18 or over. In every other province, it's essentially a sliding scale. So basically, we as physicians, if we see a 16-year-old, we have to determine, are they mature enough, are they capable of making this decision? So they might be capable in the way that a 17-year-old might not, depending on the circumstances. So we don't know what an adult is. So this person has to clearly consent to the termination of life, and they have to have a grievous and irremediable medical condition. So let's think about that for a second. So I've talked about this issue to thousands, maybe tens of thousands of Canadian doctors, and every time I talk to them, I say, who in this room, and be honest, has ever told a patient they have a grievous condition? Who has ever said, Mr. Smith, I have terrible news. Your condition is grievous. And one of them raised their hand. Out of those tens of thousands, one person put up their hand. I said, come on, you never said that. And she said in this little British voice, yes, I have. And I said, oh, you're British, of course. Of course it's grievous. But for every other doctor in Canada, we have no idea what grievous means, right? It's not in any of the medical textbooks. It's not in any of the dictionaries. It's meaningless. And yet this is what the Supreme Court has left us with. Irremediable is a little bit clearer, but it's still a bit fuzzy. So irremediable basically means not amenable to treatment or has failed therapy. But let's think about that for a second. What if I'm a doctor and I have a depressed patient? And the depressed patient says, I'm so depressed that I don't want to live and I want you to take my life. And I say, well, have you tried an antidepressant? No. Have you tried psychotherapy? No. Have you tried anything? No. Well, is their condition irremediable? No. I don't know. So based on what they're telling me, I don't want any of these interventions. I don't want this done to my body, which is their right. I don't know how I determine if that's irremediable or not. So you see the challenge for Canadian doctors looking at what the court has given us, trying to figure out who qualifies. So this condition has to be caused by an illness, a disease, or a disability that causes enduring suffering that's intolerable to the individual in those circumstances. And we certainly all recognize the subjective nature of suffering, right? So what's tolerable to me may not be to you and vice versa. So when this decision came down and we were still sitting around trying to sort of wrap our heads around this at the CMA, and someone said to me, Jeff, wouldn't every single one of your patients qualify for this? And I thought about it, and I look after patients who have spinal cord injuries, and I thought, well, by any definition, they have a grievous and irremediable condition. A lot of them are suffering. Pretty much all of them are adults. Most of them are competent. Yeah, every single one of my patients would qualify for assisted dying based on this, and I broke out into a cold sweat, and I really haven't had a good night's sleep since then. This is like every doctor's worst nightmare, this ruling, right? Because not only does it foist upon the medical profession something that most of us didn't want in the first place, the provisions are so broad that we have no idea what to do with them. And we're really struggling as a profession to figure out how to deal with this and how we can move forward. And again, the declaration of invalidity was suspended for 12 months, so Parliament has 12 months to decide or not to act on this and come up with legislation or not. And so the clock is now ticking to February 6th of next year. It's always nice when, like me, you spend dozens and hundreds of hours crafting these submissions to the Supreme Court to see your language reflected back to you. And so we were very pleased and honored that they quoted our submission quite extensively. And what they said was that we support the right of all physicians to follow their conscience. And we want to see our policy reflected in anything that comes forward. And they also said, in their view, nothing in the Declaration of Invalidity would compel physicians to provide assistance in dying. And I think we've all sort of landed on a place where we agree that no one's going to force a doctor to participate in this against their wishes. I think that would be a really awful thing for everyone. But they went on to say the Declaration renders the criminal prohibition invalid. What follows is in the hands of colleges, parliament, and the legislatures. And what we're struggling with now as a profession is, if I don't want to participate, what is my responsibility after that? So can I just sort of step outside the room and say you're on your own, or do I have to facilitate access to assisted dying in some way? Because for a lot of my colleagues, they say, look, if I have to make a referral to another doctor, that's just the same as me doing the procedure. And they have very deeply held moral views on this. So it's something we're really struggling with at the moment. We were very troubled by the fact that there was no reference whatsoever to a requirement for a terminal illness in the ruling. And I think most Canadians, when they think about this issue and they think about assisted dying, they're thinking about people that are at the end of their life, they have a physical illness, they're suffering, the pain control isn't holding them, and this is like the last resort, right? And I think this is what most of us sort of have in mind. The Supreme Court really opened it up to all sorts of other categories of people. And then someone said to me, oh, well, maybe they just forgot to put that in. And so after I fired them, I said, you know, I really don't think they did, because that was really part of the discussion at the Supreme Court was, should it just be for people with a terminal illness? Certainly that was our view. We also need some clarity on how we're going to report this, how we're going to record these and feed it back to doctors and the public. We also need a lot more clarity around what the process is going to look like. And I referenced this issue about the possibility of referring to another physician. And then we also asked, is it just physicians or other healthcare providers? And we actually went to a constitutional lawyer and we asked them, based on your reading of this decision, could other healthcare providers participate as well? For example, nurse practitioners. And they said no. The way the court has worded this, it very clearly refers specifically to physicians. And again, I broke out into a cold sweat. And so I've spoken with a lot of groups, and one of the points I really want to make is that physicians are being dragged kicking and screaming into this, right? So 29% of my colleagues have said I will participate. None of those have said this is something I was really hoping for. So those who will participate are doing it out of compassion and because they see patients suffering who they don't want to suffer, but none of us have asked for this. And one of the lectures that I gave in Fredericton before, one of the doctors in the audience raised their hands and they said, by the way, are there any pharmacists in here? Thank goodness. So they said, give it to those damn pharmacists. They're trying to do everything else we do. Let them have this, and then maybe they'll stop bothering us and they'll go away. And they can give the drugs, and we won't have to worry about it. But that didn't fly, so it's back to doctors again. I'm going to talk briefly about our neighbors in Quebec. So Quebec Bill 52 is an act respecting end-of-life care. And basically, this is the first law in Canada around assisted dying, and it means that every institution has to offer end-of-life care, which includes palliative care, palliative and terminal sedation, and what they call medical aid in dying. Medical aid in dying is really euthanasia. So euthanasia is when I, as a physician, I give you a medication, not you, just the hypothetical you, a medication, and it ends in your death. And there's no other therapeutic intent behind that. So it's not like I gave you a lot of morphine to alleviate your pain and suffering, and as an unintended consequence, your lifespan was shortened. This is like giving you a medication that has no other intent. Assisted dying or assisted suicide is when I prescribe a medication and you take it yourself, right? And basically, we're pretty sure that the Supreme Court ruling really allows for both in Canada, but in Quebec, it's just euthanasia. And they have a long list of criteria that are quite interesting and differ somewhat from the Supreme Court. So they have to be of full age, suffer from an incurable serious illness, but they have to be at the end of their life. So they actually, in Quebec, they specify that patients need to have a terminal illness and be at the end of their life. They have to have an irreversible decline in capability and have unbearable physical or psychological pain. So they can have just psychological pain, but it has to be accompanied by a life-terminating illness. So that's a little bit different than what the Supreme Court has told us. It also allows doctors to refuse to take part, but then if they decide to do that, they have to inform an administrator who will find another physician to do it instead. And there are provisions in place for oversight and reporting. So they are rapidly coming up. And here's another point I want to make. So they passed this bill in June, and they basically said, even though this is now legal, we need 18 months to put the infrastructure in place, right? And frankly, even that is a little fast. And so they are saying by December of this year, they anticipate this service will be available in Quebec, but there's all sorts of recent controversies. They've got palliative care doctors who are saying we want nothing to do with this. They've got palliative care facilities that are pulling out and saying we will not allow this on our premises. The Minister of Health is pulling out what little hair he has left and saying, you know, I'm going to make you do this with laws. And they're just all up in arms. And the rest of Canada should be looking at this and going, whoa, you know, you've had 18 months to deal with this, and you know, you as a province have always said how progressive you are on this issue, and look at the challenges that you're facing even now. So there's lots of work still to be done there. So I'm going to just switch gears a tiny bit, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what the CMA has been doing in this area and some of the activities that we've had. So I made reference briefly earlier to the town hall. So I'm going to back up. So about 5 years ago, I went to the board of directors and I said, look, I see this coming. This is going to be a big issue for our members in like about 4 or 5 years. And I think we need to start talking about it and doing a little bit of research about it now. And I said, can I go out and just do a survey of doctors in Canada and see where we are on this? Because we hadn't really done a survey on this in about 10 years, and I wanted to take the pulse. And they said, whoa, that's so controversial. You know, if we do that, the papers might get a hold of it, and they might say doctors are talking about dying, and who wants that? So I said, all right. And then I waited a year, and I went back, and I said, look, things aren't getting any better. There's some court cases coming down the pipeline you should know about. We really need to do this. So very reluctantly, they said, okay, we'll let Blackmer go and do his thing, and if we just sort of let him go, then he probably won't bother us again. And so I went and I did the survey, and it turned out that physicians' views and attitudes were changing, and that we saw there was a little bit more support for assisted dying, a little bit more support for a change in the law. So then I did sort of wait for a little while, and then I went back to them and I said, look, it was a new board, we had a few new members, a little bit more progressive, and I said, we've got a court case coming down the pipeline in BC. I can see it heading to the Supreme Court. I'm hearing rumblings in Quebec that they're talking about having cross-provincial town halls there. I think we need to do something about this. And the board, to their credit, said, yep, I think you're actually right. So about 2 years ago, so in the fall of 2013, they dedicated a lot of money and a lot of resources to saying, let's go out and talk about this. And you know, up until now, I don't know if you guys have ever noticed, but whenever they corner a politician and they say, what do you think about assisted dying? The politician always says, yeah, that's a really tough one. We've really got to get together and talk about this as a society. And then there's like crickets in the back of the room. And so we said, look, clearly the government's not going to do this. Let's do it for them. Let's do it on behalf of Canadians. Let's go out and do some public town halls and let's talk about this. So we started in St. John's in February, and we were all shocked when there was an ice storm, and no one could come except for this little group of church ladies who somehow made it out that evening, and a few other stragglers from the bars. And so we started in St. John's in February, and we went all across the country. And of course, we chose some smaller places and bigger places and different geographies. And it was amazing. It was such a phenomenal experience. And we were there to listen. We weren't there to tell people anything. We weren't there to tell them what doctors thought or what they should think. We said, we want to hear from Canadians. Tell us what you think about this stuff. And so we partnered with Maclean's magazine, and they had a senior editor moderate each one of these, and we had a 3-person panel. And each panel, it was myself and a local palliative care physician and a local member of the public who had some experience with sort of the palliative care system or the healthcare system. And it was really just phenomenal what we heard. And we divided it up into 4 parts. So we talked about terminology, so we got everyone sort of on the same page about what we were speaking about. We talked about advanced care planning or living wills and the importance of talking about these things with your families. We talked about palliative care and about access to palliative care locally and people's experience with that. And then finally, we talked about medical aid in dying. And we saved that till last, and we only had a certain amount of time because we knew otherwise we'd be hijacked and we'd spend the whole 2 hours talking about this. And at the end, people said, thank goodness you didn't let us just talk about that, because I learned so much about all these other issues that we're not talking about because all we're doing is talking about medical aid in dying. And it was such a privilege for us to be able to go and listen to these stories. It was honestly almost like being in a doctor's office, the way people were unburdening themselves and telling us about these profound and very personal experiences that obviously, shaped their lives. And this one woman up in Whitehorse, a young lady, said, I went to live with my grandmother when I was very young, and I wasn't much older when she contracted a life-ending illness, and I know that if assisted dying had been available, she would have taken it because she didn't want to be a burden on me. I had to change her dressings, and I had to do this, and I had to do that, and I know she would have availed herself of that. And she said, but those last few months were the best time we had together. They were the most important time we could have ever spent, and I would have lost that. And we heard that, and then we heard other people say, my husband or my wife or my loved one suffered, and we didn't have palliative care, and Canadian healthcare is failing us without this. And it was very powerful stuff. And so we published a report, and we heard that we need a common lexicon here. We need to be talking about the same things. We heard that all Canadians should discuss their end-of-life wishes with their families or other loved ones, and I would encourage you to do so. We also need to make sure that we keep helping people prepare advance directives. And again, we also very clearly heard about the need for a national palliative care strategy with appropriate services, better funding, and a lot more education. And I was talking to some people at the reception beforehand, and we need to do a better job as a profession. We have failed as a profession to understand the importance and the value of palliative care services. So I still hear about doctors saying, no, I won't refer you to palliative care because you're not like hours away from dying yet. And that's not the point of palliative care. That's the furthest thing away from the point of palliative care. And yet we still as a profession even have these ideas about what it is and what it isn't. So we need to educate our profession a lot better on those issues. We heard that the public is divided on whether the current Canadian ban on euthanasia should be maintained. We also heard, and this is a little ironic in light of what subsequently happened, that if the law is changed, strict protocols and safeguards are needed to protect vulnerable individuals and populations. And I remain very afraid that this may not be the case based on the Supreme Court decision. And then we also went out and talked to our members. And generally what happens is, so we do this a fair bit. So we sort of, on our website, we say, are you interested in issue X? If so, come and tell us your thoughts on it. And we get like 5 or 10 members, and some of them are lost on the website, and some of them really are interested in the issue. And so we put this out there, and 1,200 physicians, which might not seem like a lot, but for this type of an exercise was beyond anything we'd ever seen, registered, and gave us just hundreds and hundreds of very thoughtful comments. And I just want to touch on that point for a second. So I've had a lot of conversations with people over the last few years about this, and we talk a lot about sort of the parallels and differences with the abortion debate and how heated the abortion debate tends to be. And one thing I've noticed about assisted dying is that even though people have very different viewpoints, the dialogue is completely different. It tends to be extremely respectful. And I have a variety of opinions on why that is, but it's something that a lot of people have reflected back to me over time, that people might say, I don't agree with you. I don't think this should be available, but I understand, where you're coming from, and your heart is in the right place. You don't want to see people suffer. And people will say, I understand why you think life is sacrosanct. I get that, and I respect that. I just think that quality of life is more important. And I was in Vancouver doing another one of these sessions, and this woman from Australia tweeted me. So she's a palliative care physician in Australia, and we'd been corresponding a bit on Twitter. And she knew that this session was happening, and she said, look, Jeff, I happen to be in town. Do you mind if I come just be a fly on the wall? So I asked the organizer of the session, and they said, of course, have her come sit in. So she sat in, and it happened that at that session, the medical director of Dying with Dignity and the medical director of the Anti-Euthanasia Coalition for Canada were in the same room, and they happened to be seating 2 people apart, and they can't stand each other to start with. And they have completely opposite views on this issue, and yet the dialogue could not have been more respectful. I mean, respectfully, I'm not sure I can agree with that, but I certainly understand where you're coming from. Your heart is in the right place, and I know why your members feel that way, and they would respond very respectfully. And so this woman from Australia came up to me after and said, where are the cameras? There is no way that was a real discussion. I know Canadians are polite, but you're putting me on. Okay? You hired a whole bunch of actors to come in here to fool the Aussie girl. It's all very funny. But no, and that's really been my experience throughout this. It's just been incredible the way people have really taken this dialogue to a very high place. And it's allowed us, I think, to really, as Canadians, have this very difficult conversation. And we also I went around and did an in-person member consultation as well. And I've highlighted Fredericton here because that was a real highlight for me to come back home and we meet with our members. And again, we talked to the folks at the New Brunswick Medical Society, and even with dinner, they usually only get about 5 or 10 people. And we had a packed house down at the Delta for this one. People just want to come and talk about this. And so what we really heard clearly from our members is that unlike 10, 15, maybe even 5 years ago, Canadian doctors are really ready to try and help lead this conversation. And death and dying are no longer taboo subjects for us. We recognize the importance of all the things that go along with that, advanced care planning and palliative care, and we remain divided on the issue of assisted death. And we took everything that we had heard throughout this year-long process, and we brought it forward to our General Council meeting in Ottawa last year, and we passed a resolution that basically said the CMA will support the right of all physicians within bounds of legislation to follow their conscience when deciding whether or not to provide medical aid in dying. And generally, I know you guys haven't been to General Council, but nothing passes with 100% support at General, because there's always a joker in the back of the room who hits no or who sits on their voting thing or whatever. But this passed with 91%, which blew me away. I actually thought this would be defeated. And it really showed me that the profession is starting to unite in one key way. We're not united on whether we support this or don't support this. We're united on the fact that this is coming and we need to deal with it, and we will deal with it as a united profession. And this was a watershed moment for the CMA in a lot of ways because it allowed us then to participate in the Supreme Court discussion in a very nuanced way that we wouldn't have been able to before. And it's allowed me to go out and have these conversations in a very open and nuanced way. And so that was a really important moment for us, I think, as a profession. So I'm going to close by talking a little bit about what's going to happen over the next few weeks and months. So we will continue, the CMA will continue advocating on behalf of physicians for a framework that we've developed called a principles-based CMA legislative framework. I've actually been working on this for about 2.5 years, and I hired a summer student to come in and help talk to colleagues that we have in other countries that have dealt with this, and tried to craft it in a way that would sort of reflect Canadian values and this type of thing. And people have said, wow, Jeff, did you have a crystal ball? How did you see this coming? And I said, no, I have a subscription to a newspaper and I read it. And you could see this coming a mile away, right? We all knew that the way that the groundswell of public opinion was going, the way these court cases were going, you could really sort of see where this was all going to end up. And so this is something we've really been working on behind the scenes for a long time. And so we've now prepared a document that we're using really to try and represent the views of physicians. And it addresses a number of the unanswered questions from the Supreme Court decision and some of the gaps that are most relevant to practicing doctors. And what we're doing is we're using that document to present our views to federal and provincial legislators and others on some of the key issues. So here's, I won't read all these principles, but as I say, it's a principles-based document, and it's undergirded by these key ethical principles. And it really provides views of Canadian physicians on issues like determining who should qualify for assisted dying, what process should be followed. And so a lot of the questions that I get from members are just things like, if someone shows up in my office on February 6th, what do I do? Are there forms I need to fill out? Is there someone I should call? They just want to know, what do I do with people who are requesting this? So we're trying to set out a process that can be followed. And so what we're doing is we're taking this document, this framework document, and we're having ongoing discussion with federal and provincial governments. So I've met with a number of federal MPs from every party, so we're meeting across party lines, and obviously this is slightly complicated by this little short election period that we're having now, and we're sort of telling them, look, we need a federal approach, and so when the election is done, we expect you to get to work on this right away, because we cannot have a patchwork of provincial approaches. At the same time, we recognize that may not happen. So I'm also going around and I'm meeting with all the ministers of health in each province and territory. And I'm saying, look, if the federal government isn't able to come up with an approach, we would like to see all the provinces get together and figure this out in a unified way so that we don't end up with all these different laws from province to province. And so that's one of the things that's been occupying my time lately. There's also 2 expert advisory panels that have recently been struck. So the federal government struck one, and it's on hold now during the election period. And then the provinces all got together and they struck another one, and it's actually doing its work. So we've been interacting with them and providing them with input and advice on behalf of Canadian physicians. And then the other thing that we're doing at the same time, as I've sort of referred to, is ongoing support for doctors. So doctors are going to be at the front line whether we like it or not. We've got in-person events. I'm going to Whitehorse again soon. I had this rural Ontario tour in the summer where I went to these towns that I didn't know existed. Did you guys know there's a Porcupine, Ontario? There's a South Porcupine, Ontario as well. So I go to these places and I meet with members and I bring them up to date. And you can't really get any more grassroots than that. I do webinars as well with people across the country. I meet with lots of different boards and members. I do events like this where I meet with members of the public and I talk to them about what's happening and what the CMA is doing. And then the other major thing that we have coming down the pipe is an educational program. And so as I alluded to earlier, this is brand new, right? So it's not being taught in medical schools, it's not being taught in residency. No practicing physician really knows how to do this. So we talked to a few other groups and they all said, we don't want to have anything to do with that. It's, you're welcome to it. So we are actually in the process of trying to plan some educational modules for doctors who elect to participate. And it's not just focused on the technical aspects. What it's really intended to do is make those doctors really good at end-of-life care. Every part of end-of-life care, not just the single act of assisted dying, but the conversations and the communication and the palliative care and the pain and symptom management and all the other things that should be a part of high quality care at the end of life. So again, silver lining to all this is that end of life care, I think in Canada, is going to improve a lot over the years. And what we've actually seen in other jurisdictions where assisted dying is legalized is the access to palliative care improves, sometimes drastically. And that's a result of having these open conversations and bringing death sort of out of the closet and saying this needs to be part of the continuum of care in these systems. So we're hoping that will be the case in Canada as well. So the objective really of all this is to see the views of physicians who ultimately will be responsible for this clearly reflected in what's going to come forward so that we make sure that patients who need it have access, physicians' rights will be protected, and we, to the greatest extent possible, prevent potential abuses. And I'll close with this slide. So I've been using this slide now for a number of years in my presentations, and I've been telling people this is the perfect storm of end-of-life care in Canada. I said, the Carter case is coming, Bill 52 is coming. All these things are coming together, and we need to be ready. And to its credit, I think the board of directors of the Canadian Medical Association believe this, and so we have really tried to be out in front of a number of these issues, and our goal is really to be an honest, sort of neutral broker, and to make sure that Canadians like you, are protected to the extent possible, have access to these services, and have faith that the medical profession is acting in your best interest. So thank you very much for your attention, and I appreciate it.
Yes, you mentioned that the national panel is sort of taking a break because of the election. They still have a website where you can go and express your views. There's a questionnaire that they lead you through, and you can go and express your views on it as to how the process might work. So I just want to let people know that they can continue to do that, even though the panel is on a hiatus.
That's right. Thank you for pointing that out, and that's very true. And that is actually the absolute intent of that website, is not necessarily to get input from organizations, but from individual Canadians. And I'd also just like to point out, and you'll find this interesting, just a few hours ago I found out that panel has requested a copy of the tape from tonight, so you will actually be appearing before the panel, sir, even though you didn't know that coming in tonight. So thank you. Someone in the back up there. Yeah, because for the cameras you need it. So then you'll be appearing before the panel as well.
Just their voice.
Just the voice.
Okay. My name's Nathan. I guess these are working. I was wondering if, thank you for the presentation, first of all. And I was wondering if, not to make this cold or anything, but there is an economic impact to this. I know that in the United States they've done quite a bit of research on this, looking at end-of-care costs and the fact that, the last couple of years, months, weeks of a person's life are medically the most expensive. Has Canada done any of that research on our own system and looked at how, effectively this isn't about an extra cost, but a reallocation of medical resources?
Yeah, so I'll make maybe a few points about that. Number one is that for the most part, we physicians have tried to keep those issues as separate as possible, because we want to make sure that patients are confident and know that we're making decisions in their best individual interests rather than with sort of an eye on the bottom line. So we really leave those questions more up to a system level kind of discussion. I will say that yes, there's lots of research in Canada looking at sort of how much money goes into care in the last few weeks or months or years of life, and we know that it's obviously disproportionate to the money that goes in up front. And then the final thing I'll say is that if we do want to link care and cost-benefit analysis, I would suggest that the way that we do that, or the place that we do that, is actually palliative care rather than assisted dying, because what we know from palliative care is that costs go way down compared to an ICU bed, and yet people are still getting care, and in fact, in many cases, better care for them as individuals, or more appropriate care than they were receiving in a $10,000 a night ICU bed. So where we do try and make that argument is generally around the palliative care piece, and we try and stay away from that in the assisted dying realm. It's a great question.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm just wondering what your plan is for the doctor's oath. Like, should you change it in any way?
Yeah, so another good question. So what you're referring to mostly is the traditional Hippocratic Oath, right, from Hippocrates, the great Greek physician. And one of the things in the Hippocratic Oath is I will never give a substance to a patient that will hasten their death or dying. So obviously speaks against assisted dying. Now, interestingly, there's also provisions in there against therapeutic abortion, which is now a legalized medical service. And so what's actually happened over the years is that almost in fact, it might now be every medical school in Canada has adopted a version of the Hippocratic Oath, which doesn't have the original content, but which addresses a number of those issues without specifics. So it's a really good point, but I hear from a lot of you know, especially doctors who went through training when they did take the Hippocratic Oath, who say, I clearly took an oath and I'm not going back on that oath. And I think that's a very reasonable sort of moral position to hold. And again, it's one that we respect and we will protect. So for physicians who have said, I went through this system, I went through it with a certain understanding, I didn't sign on for assisted dying, I think they're right. And I think we need to make sure that they don't feel under pressure to provide that. You guys need to make sure they get their exercise. So.
I had a few questions. One, you mentioned that there would have to be capacity checks for people who wanted to undergo the procedure. Would there also have to be capacity checks for the physicians who would be like going through the motions of the procedure?
You want me to answer that one first? Short answer, I hope not, because I have a lot of doubt about some of my colleagues. No, I mean, I think really probably the bigger answer there is that, you know, that this is something doctors do every day, right? So every single person we see, to some extent, we have to judge their capacity. Now, usually it's not a big deal, and the default position is that you're all capable to make these decisions. We only sort of question that when it's a really important life or death decision, or we have any reason to think that people might be incapable. I think the challenge with assisted dying, again, is the finality of that. And so I'm anticipating that people will take it a few steps further and get second and third opinions on that. And maybe they'll be the ones who then assess physicians. I don't know.
I guess the question more so that I was asking was, would the physicians who would be like implementing the procedures, like going through the actual surgery or procedure or however you want to word it, would they have to be given capacity checks, you know, for coming to grips with the fact that they are ending someone's life?
So to make sure that they're able to do that, or that they have the training?
Well, not necessarily training, but you may feel compassionate enough to do that, but when you don't know, like it's something that hasn't been done, it's a frontier that hasn't been explored in the medical field, and you don't really know, am I going to be able to handle this until afterwards?
Okay, so I think I know where you're going. So part of what we want to do with our vision is that we provide training and education for physicians, and at the other end of that, we provide support for them. And so we provide a community of support where physicians can, online or in person or otherwise, share experiences, but also talk about how this impacts on them. So I have a colleague who's probably the most vocal proponent of assisted dying in Canada, and he says to me all the time, I already have PTSD. I haven't even started this, and I wake up every night with nightmares about assisted dying. And he's at the forefront of pushing for this to be legalized. So we already recognize the impact this is going to have on physicians. So we are setting up systems and making sure we already have a physician health system where we link physicians with other doctors to help them through various things. And this is going to be, I think, a test of that system.
And would this be an expectation of general physicians, or would they have to be a specialist to do that?
Yeah, so that's a good question as well. What we're anticipating is that certainly initially it looks like it will be mostly family doctors and GPs, because they're the ones that provide that continuum of care. We know as well that the support amongst the general community is a little bit higher than it is in the specialist community. We know palliative care doctors, by and large, do not want to be involved in this. They want a very clear distinction between palliative care services and assisted dying. Now, the last part of that is that in the Netherlands, they actually do have specialists who are specially trained. And so what happens is a family doctor assesses the patient first, goes through a first assessment, and then refers them to a specialist who does a much more detailed assessment. We don't see that happening in Canada right out of the gate, but it may be something that happens in evolution.
And one last question, I apologize for hogging the microphone. You mentioned that only 20% of Canadians have access to palliative care. If assisted suicide was meant to kind of be an alternative option or a final last resort option to that, how would you go about ensuring that if a patient wanted it, they would have, you know, a reasonable percentage of possibility of actually achieving their wants?
So how would they have a chance of achieving access to
Yeah.
palliative care? Yeah. And so I don't have an easy answer to that. The answer is really that we need to continue to advocate. So Quebec, actually, one of the things I like about Quebec's law is that it requires access to end-of-life care, and as part of end-of-life care, it actually lists palliative care. And they've actually started to put resources into palliative care. So what they're basically saying is every Quebec citizen has to have access to palliative care, and we'd like to see that replicated in the rest of Canada. Now, the resource implications for that are pretty significant, but we have to start somewhere.
Just with respect to your point about individuals needing to be adults and competent, how would that affect to seek physician-assisted dying? How would that affect individuals who have Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia? Would they, to avoid prematurely ending their lives?
Yeah, and that is a good question, and I think that's a challenge with the way that they've set this out. So it's pretty clear to us, and again, this was something that we asked our independent lawyer to weigh in on, that they really intend it just to be for people who are currently capable, so that they can't sort of set it out in a living will. But you're right, it's a little bit paradoxical to some of the court's other arguments, which were essentially that part of the reason for allowing this would be so that someone, for example, with ALS would not have to end their life months earlier because they would know that this would be available to them down the line. But what we may now have created is a system where people with early onset dementia might choose to end their lives earlier than if it were available later. Now, they would have access to assisted dying at that point, but like I say, a lot of them might think, well, I'll just wait and I'll spend many more months and years with my family because I know it will be available when I'm really not capable. And it doesn't look like that will be the case right now. Now, I should point out that we're anticipating a lot of challenges to this ruling. So the age is another one where we're really thinking that people are going to say, look, there's no justifiable reason for saying that someone who's not competent shouldn't be able to access this if they set it out in a living will. And frankly, they'll probably win. But that will take a court challenge and it'll have to work its way through. And it's the same with age. We're thinking that someone who's 15 will probably say, I'm being discriminated against based on my age. And frankly, they'll probably win as well. But it will take time for that to happen.
So thank you very much for the presentation. I'm a palliative care physician, so obviously this is something very close to my heart, as well as many of my colleagues. One of the things that's important in palliative care is that we work as part of a team. And nurses, pharmacists, physiotherapists, there are many... Sorry, can you hear me now?
Oh, yeah.
I feel like that commercial. So I'm a palliative care physician, as I just said, and I work as part of a team. So there's nurses, pharmacists, many different multidisciplinary professionals involved in our care. And I'm curious, I understand the CMA's position, I understand the palliative care physician's opinion, but I'm curious about how other professional organizations are dealing with this. So what is the nurses' organizations, what's their stance? Because obviously, although I may be writing the prescription, or may not be writing the prescription, depending on my own personal decisions, someone else is going to be obviously involved in that care. So what are some of the other pharmacists, nurses across Canada saying? Yeah,
great question. And honestly, right now, they're not saying very much. And what we are hearing from them, and we have reached out to them, we have sent them all our documents and asked them for feedback, and we've tried to engage them in conversation. And so far, mostly what we're hearing is a lot of emphasis on making sure that members will not be forced to participate against their wishes. So that pharmacists would not be forced to fill a prescription if they objected to that on a moral basis, or a nurse would not be forced to take part in that procedure or to assist in that procedure if they objected to it. I'm still waiting for sort of some more policies or guidelines to come out of those organizations. I think a lot of them are waiting to see a little bit how the legislation evolves exactly and then react, because they do recognize that certainly the direct impact is on doctors, but there's absolutely no question it goes much further than that within the team, and even to the therapists that look after the patient and the technicians and everyone involved in the care of that patient is affected when this sort of issue arises, even if they're not directly involved in the act. we'll try and get to everyone.
Hi. You said you're hoping for a national strategy,
Yeah.
Canadian national strategy, but we all basically know that healthcare in Canada is provincial.
Yeah.
So what happens, can provinces opt out of this? And what happens if you're in a province where there's, thousands of people without a family doctor and can't access what they need?
Yeah, so that's a good question as well. So absolutely, we're hoping for a federal approach. That's plan A. Plan B is a provincial approach with sort of a unified set of principles and guidelines. Provinces cannot opt out of this. This is going to be the law of the land soon, and basically what will happen is, unless there is an extension granted by the Supreme Court, which may be a possibility, particularly if another party gets into power, unless that happens on February 6th, those criminal code provisions will cease to exist and nothing will take their place, which means it will be legal for physicians to do this. And that's a federal law, right? That's federal jurisdiction in the criminal code, and the provinces have nothing to do with that. So they can put in place their own sort of regimes or their own legislation in response to the Supreme Court decision. Our worry is that some of them will do that in a very restrictive way, some of them will do that in a very loose way, and we'll have a complete patchwork of approaches. And we'll have, so for example, if one province says, we will allow for assisted dying if you have psychological suffering, and another province says we won't, you can easily imagine what's going to happen between those provinces, right? So we would really like to see some consistency. It's coming, whether the provinces want it or not. And this is really one of the reasons why we never reach out to provincial ministers of health. We've never done that. We turn 150 the same year as Canada. This is the first time we've done something like this because of the importance of the issue. So we're going through our, doctors, the New Brunswick Medical Society and Doctors Nova Scotia, we're working with our provincial counterparts, but it's just critical to make sure that everyone understands what's at stake here, because regardless of what individual provinces wish would happen, it's gonna happen on February 6th.
So will it be covered under Medicare?
So no, I'm gonna bill privately. No, that isn't on, is it? No. So one of my colleagues at the CMA used to jokingly, when this was like way in the future, used to jokingly say, we can't let this happen until we have a fee code for billing for it. And he always said, don't tell anyone I said that. So I won't say his name. Yes, it will be covered under Medicare, and there will be some type of fee code. What I'd really, really like to see is that it's covered under end-of-life care, right? So that we start saying, here's the kind of coverage we're going to give to these conversations. We're going to set aside hours so that doctors can sit and meet with patients and family members and hold their hands and give them the Kleenex and talk about all the options, not just this, but everything on the table, and have this as one piece of that thing that's compensated by Medicare and that the physician is paid for, not just the assisted dying.
So what if you don't have a family doctor? Can you walk into walk-in clinic and ask for it? Because that's what we're doing at Bridgerton.
Yeah, so I mean, the same can be, I think you can say the same thing for a lot of different sort of specialized services, right? That's not the ideal. And I mean, for 1,000 different reasons, we want everyone to have access to a family doctor. This is one of those reasons, right? So I would say that, when we look at access issues just by the numbers, we're not really concerned about access, because even though we're talking about maybe 30% of members, that's like, 25,000 doctors are going to be participating. In a center like Fredericton, you're not going to have a hard time finding someone who will assist you with this. In rural and remote areas, it might be a different issue.
Back one more time on the competency issue. You spoke of competency at the time of the actual application of. Thank you. You spoke of competency at the actual time that the procedure would take place. I'm wondering what might be the case if you've got not only an advance directive or living will, but you also have an enduring power of attorney for medical care, and that person is speaking on your behalf and obviously still is competent.
Right.
I wonder if that would give any extra weight and whether that might lead to some sort of court decision.
Yeah, so, and it's a good question. Based on our interpretation, it wouldn't change things, but it would take some sort of a challenge to see if that stood up to the Supreme Court decision. And it's true for a lot of these things. So, you know, the Supreme Court has set this out. We've been told very clearly that if you tried to pass a law that said, you know, there's a requirement for a terminal illness, we've been told that would be declared unconstitutional, but it would take a challenge to that law to make that declaration possible. And so that's why we're not quite sure what provinces are going to do. We're also not quite sure what the federal government's going to do. I mean, they have certainly their views on this issue, and we don't know sort of how closely they're going to hew to the Supreme Court decision or whether they might take a little bit of a different perspective.
What are your thoughts on protecting vulnerable people from probably being encouraged or nudged into having support to die?
Yeah, and that's a real issue right now. And I'll start that conversation by just sort of saying something that was very interesting for me. So as I mentioned, my whole clinical practice is looking after patients with spinal cord injury. So all of my patients are disabled, and a lot of them have suffering to some degree. So I'm very sensitive to these types of issues. And probably most of you don't know that the lawyer in the Carter case arguing for a change in the legislation is a guy named Joe Davray. And Joe, when he was a teenager, had a ski accident and became a paraplegic. And so he's in a wheelchair. And the visual of him sort of wheeling back and forth in front of the Supreme Court was amazing and very striking. And what he said was basically, I don't want you to treat me as a disabled person any differently. I want the same rights and burdens as every other Canadian. And so he said, you know, we can surely, as a society, as an enlightened society, we can craft legislation that can protect everyone who's vulnerable for any reason, whether it's disability or mental illness or anything that might enhance their vulnerability. We can do it. And so that's the challenge before us now. And one of the things that we're trying to push for at the CMA is some very specific and very real waiting periods. So between the request and a second request, and then having a second opinion and another waiting period, and these cooling off periods to allow for sort of sober reflection. We're trying to do that. And as part of our education, what we're going to try and do is really sensitize people to the pressure, whether it's overt or subconscious, that families sometimes put on patients. Because what we hear a lot is from patients and families is about being a burden, right? And so I think we really need to be sensitive to the fact that if someone feels like they're a burden, they might ask for assisted death much earlier than if they feel well supported. And so we need to do a better job of surfacing some of those issues as part of our training of physicians to make them more sensitive to some of that and to make sure they take the time to look at some of those issues. So there's no sort of, I think, framework or regulatory regime that you can craft that will be perfect, that will protect everyone, but we need to put enough checks and balances and stopping points in there so that we can feel like we're addressing most of them. But that's a big challenge for us based on the court decision.
And sometimes other people think that a life is not worth living if you need to have support.
Yeah.
And that's not a feeling of people living a different life often.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, that relates as well to the resources that we put into that type of support. So we were here, the CMA was here earlier this week talking about seniors care and talking about the need to shift some of the resources that we have into things like home care. And I think the same is true here for death and dying. We need to make sure that people feel supported in their homes, not just by family caregivers, but by professional caregivers, so that they don't feel like they're a burden. But right now, the system can't sustain that. So we need to take, you know, we talked about savings. If we can get people out of ICU beds and back to home where we already know they'd rather die, take the $10,000 a night that they're not using in the ICU and put it into home care, we'd be doing a lot of people a lot of good, and we'd take a lot of that burden off of the family. You guys really aren't Jays fans here, are you?
I liked how you talked about within the room there being that polite debate. And I can't even imagine with that many people's thoughts and experiences, just given the debate going on in my own head. I'm a family doc who also works in nursing home, and so sees life and appreciates life in all its phases, but then also sees the patients with ALS or COPD that are just begging for the feeling of suffocating to stop. So I'm not entirely sure where I stand, but I guess I was hoping you could comment on the professional risk taking by the physicians that are going to do this. And in particular, I'm thinking of, I understand at a cognitive level, assessing competency and signing consent forms and that sort of thing. But then I'm thinking of the family members who maybe not agree with the individual who's making that decision for themselves, and the repercussions or the backlash, for lack of a better word, in that relationship.
Yeah, so that's a good question as well. And I hear that from lots of my colleagues, right? Saying, I want to participate in this, I want to alleviate pain and suffering, but boy, if there's ever a time in my career I'm going to get sued, it's probably this one, right? And so doctors aren't immune to those types of feelings. We're working actually very closely with the CMPA. So the CMPA is our liability protection provider for physicians in Canada. They're concerned about this as well, obviously. And what we're really trying to do is set up a way that we can help physicians to understand that if they practice within a certain framework and within certain guidelines, we can't ever guarantee that people won't get sued, right? All we can do is say that if you're within, this parameter, it won't be successful. And I think we'll get there for this because we're all on the same page as a profession. Actually, this has been a really interesting example of all of these different medical organizations in Canada who often sort of work at cross purposes actually coming together to say, we've got to get this right and figure it out. And the CMPA has been one of those. So I think we'll be able to craft sort of a solution where there's no guarantee that someone won't come at you, but you'll be well protected if they do.
Hi, I have a quick question.
Sure.
In all your research internationally, were there any other groups that took this on, such as, besides physician-assisted, were there, technicians, specialists that did this in Switzerland or other countries internationally?
Yeah, no, there's not. The outlier though is Switzerland, where a doctor signs the prescription but really has nothing to do after that point, and generally just does a very brief and cursory assessment of the patient, and then it's up to generally a team of lay people, sometimes nurses, who sort of accompany the patient. They go usually to a very nice bungalow and they take the medication there, but the doctor is has a very small role in all that. In all the other jurisdictions, it's very much physician-centric, whether it's direct euthanasia or assisted dying.
Sorry, guys. I'm closer, I guess. Very non-medical question, but a curiosity that might influence a person's decision to go through with the whole process. In other countries, perhaps, is it known what the repercussions are on life insurance? Because I understand that if you commit suicide, that life insurance policy is no longer, it's null and void. So in a situation such as somebody coming down with terminal illness, I would think that the life insurance company would honor the fact that they, as long as they have proof that they have a terminal illness, fine. But what about these other possibly exceptional situations of suffering that is not involving a terminal illness?
Yeah, so if you read the fine print in your life insurance policy, which I know all of us always do, what it says is actually within the first 2 years of signing the policy, if you commit suicide, it's null and void. After that, it's actually in full effect. And the reason for that is basically if you're going to get life insurance to have it pay off right away, you're going to do it right away. If you wait 2 years, that time has passed. So we actually reached out to, they're called the Canadian Life Insurance Association, CLIA, and talked to them about this just to make sure that pretty much all of its members had the same provisions, and they said yes. But we've also had conversations around what to put on the death certificate, right? So because there are potentially repercussions there as well, and there's differences of opinion. In other countries, what they do almost universally is they put the underlying illness. So if someone has end-stage pulmonary disease, that's what they'll put. There's a lot of physicians in Canada who say, let's call it what it is and put assisted dying. So that's a conversation that's still ongoing. But we think the life insurance piece should be okay. I hear that question a lot, though.
This question, I think, might be premature, but I'd like to say that it might be interesting if a physician might be able to make an appeal, if he thought it was worthy, say in the province of New Brunswick, on a level with physicians who are experienced in these cases and could make a good judgment. Maybe not right away, but maybe sometime.
Sorry, so
Did you understand me?
nope.
Okay. I think sometimes, if there was a very special case, a doctor should be allowed to make an appeal to a group of people who have experience in this field.
So they should be able to reach out and get sort of more information and help with that?
Or maybe even ask for a judgment on a request.
Sure. Yeah, and that's a good point. And so we've actually, one of the things that we've talked about is, should we have some sort of a panel, right, of people to review these cases and to see if they meet the qualifications. And our concern about that has been around sort of, if you've got someone who's at the end of their life and really suffering and needs intervention right away, you don't want to sort of delay that. And we've had not great experiences with panels in other cases. But what we do think needs to be done is at least have a second opinion and have another physician who can come in and provide input and oversight and help with that decision. And there's no reason really, if those two physicians were really not sure, they couldn't ask another doctor. And really that's what happens now, right? So if, you know, if you've got a strange, funny case, doctors will reach out and ask their colleagues for insight and input, and especially those who are more experienced. So we think that will sort of happen organically, but we're not sort of advocating for that in every situation. But I think you're right, in some situations it could be very beneficial.
This may sound like a weird question. Maybe you've answered it, but I'm wondering, when you're talking about assisted dying, if there's a differentiation in the timeline. For example, does someone request, I want to die within 20 minutes, I want to die within a day, or I want to die within 3 weeks? And I ask this because my own mother, who was in Quebec at the time, was assisted in dying over a 3-week period, and that 3-week period she was lucid, she was free of pain, family members were there to visit her, and basically what she was being given through intravenous gradually shut down the different systems and organs in her body, and she slept away very peacefully. So I'm not asking, I guess, are you the executioner, and who decides? You know, is it going to be fast or?
Well, I think, and I know what you're saying, and so in some ways what you're talking about is almost but not quite terminal sedation, where you're really gradually escalating doses of medication to make sure that the pain levels are very well managed, knowing that eventually, especially without sort of artificial nutrition and hydration, it will lead to the patient's death. And really with assisted dying, it will be quick, right? So whether it's going to be a matter, and you know, again, not to sort of be flip about it, but if it's going to be minutes or hours, it's going to be quite quick. But I think my own view is that there will likely be a lot of leeway in terms of patients being able to decide. And we see this all the time now. So someone saying, look, you know, my daughter is getting married, or someone's graduating or something, and I want to live that long. Let's wait for the procedure, or let's wait for this. So obviously a lot of latitude for that. One of the things that we struggle with a little bit, and it relates a little bit to what you were saying, is how much time should we leave for that sober second thought that I was referring to around some of the safeguards, and how should that be different depending on the diagnosis? So for example, if it's someone who's suffering a lot for whatever reason, we might want to have a pretty brief period of time to let them sort of think it over because they are suffering. I have colleagues who say, and these are actually, I have colleagues at Dying with Dignity who are big proponents of assisted dying who say, maybe if it's purely psychological illness, maybe we should have a year waiting period, right? Where we can wait to see if that person gets better and we can try and treat it, and we should really sort of make sure that we've gotten it right, because that's a very controversial type of issue. So, you know, that relates a bit to the timing as well.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'm a family medicine resident here in Fredericton, and you've spoken a little bit about the kind of education surrounding the conversation, surrounding palliative care, and surrounding the actual act or procedure of physician-assisted dying. I wonder how much input the AFMC, the Association of Faculties of Medicine of Canada, has had in this conversation about how to implement curricula in undergrad and postgraduate medical education in terms of how training would go. I'm assuming it's not going to work for me, but what will happen in the future, I guess?
Sure. Yeah. No, we've been engaged. I know their CEO well, and we've been engaged pretty regularly in conversation. So we're starting to look at, you know, again, how do we look at this in the broader context of end-of-life education, right? How do we do a better job of educating physicians on care at the end of life with this as one small piece? Because traditionally, we don't do a good job of that now as it exists. And you look at the curriculum at the medical schools across Canada. Actually, this is a shocking statistic. So Canadian physicians on average have 8 hours in the undergraduate curriculum on pain control. Veterinarians have 120 hours on pain control. So literally, your dog and cat get better pain control than you do. And I think we all sort of intuitively knew that anyway. So I would really, you know, and that's really how we're approaching it with the undergraduate and the postgraduate curriculum, to say, let's take this opportunity with this much focus on end of life and dying and make it a bigger part of the whole curriculum and weave it all the way through medical school, so that by the time folks like yourselves and medical students get to the end of the training, they're not going to wonder what palliative care is and when to make a referral. They're going to know, because we've now made that part of the curriculum. So it's a huge piece.
Thank you. This one? Cool. Either. Okay. Now you alluded to this a little bit, and this is actually kind of in a similar vein as the previous question. But it seems reasonable that, for the most part, it's going to be such that older doctors are not really going to be terribly interested in providing the service. And I was kind of wondering how you feel about the younger doctors and the ones coming up bearing the brunt of having to provide the service.
Yeah, and certainly that's not what we would like to see happen. We don't certainly want to see anyone sort of shoulder the burden. I think everyone's going to have to make their own decision, right? And so when we divided out some of the questions by demographic, we certainly see a slightly higher level of support for younger doctors for this, which we see as sort of being consistent with the general public. When we ask those questions to the general public, there's a bit of higher support in the younger demographics. But we still hear a lot of very vocal medical students. So a lot of the letters and emails that I get saying I don't want to participate are from younger physicians. And they say as well, this is not what I signed on for. So I think we will see a shift as we sort of see people go through the training, but I don't think it's going to be a massive shift. And even some of our older doctors say, you know, who better to participate in this than someone, you know, who's seen so many patients through the dying process and who has familiarity with that. So we're certainly hoping not to burden our younger colleagues.
Great. And as a little bit of a follow-up, I was wondering, since you've done this yourself at least a little bit, if you have any advice for future medical students about kind of working through this conundrum for themselves.
Yeah, I think, you know, I think this is kind of maybe the start of that, right? To think about how does this sort of impact me morally, personally? What are my views? And for a lot of people, it really does, you know, you need some experience, right, as well. You need some clinical experience, and you need to be faced with some of those situations. And once you've sort of cared for someone who does die, because you're going to have patients who die, you're going to understand, what could I do in that situation? Would I be able to participate in that, or would I feel very morally compromised? And I think that's a big part of the learning, as so much in medicine, is that experience at the bedside. You can reflect all you want in this environment, but until you go through it, it's really very hypothetical.
Kind of going along with the idea of the educational program being implemented into medical schools. Will this be, I just want to clarify, will it be something that is implemented for everybody, or only those that think they want to participate in the physician-assisted diagnosis?
So that's a really good question as well. So I think what will happen, and like I sort of alluded to before, I think what we're going to see is a lot more and a lot better education around end-of-life care. And I think people need to be made aware of the laws and the regulations around assisted dying, but no more than that, right? And so it's very similar, I think, in many ways to therapeutic abortion, where as part of your medical school training, you'll understand that this is one option in terms of treatment, but no one will force you to go do an elective in that, right? And so I think it'll be very much the same for assisted dying. You need to be able to have that conversation with your patients. Even if you're not going to be the one providing the service, you need to be able to tell them, here's what the law says, here's what our province says about it, but then, you know, have someone else do it. And I think that's the way it will sort of play out for this as well.
One last question?
If you have a really burning question, I'll stay for a minute or two after.
Hi, Jeff.
Hey, Jeff.
As you know, I'm an engineer, not a doctor. I say that for two reasons. One, I'm a Star Trek fan. And number two, it's a practical question about sort of patient privacy. And I wonder about, you know, very hypothetical, a husband who wants assisted dying, but doesn't want his wife to know, or doesn't want his kids to know. How do you think that's going to get managed?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the short answer is that that everyone has a right to privacy, right? And I've seen lots of cases where, you know, not usually that drastic, but a husband will come in with whatever condition and say, I don't want my wife to know about this, and then you kind of are in the situation where you just have to say, I can't share that information with you, right? And often people put two and two together, but in this situation, and we do sort of see this now sometimes, you know, with end-of-life care, where people might say, look, I want you to increase the morphine drip, but don't tell my wife because it'll worry her. And it is the patient's right to make those decisions, and it's their right to have that information kept private. Even if it sometimes puts us in an awkward situation as physicians or as healthcare providers, we still need to do everything we can to protect that privacy. And just, you know, we always encourage people to share that information, to say, look, you know, don't you think they would want to know, and don't you think they would want to sort of go through this with you and help you shoulder the burden? But ultimately, it is the patient's decision whether they want to share that or not.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Jeff, very much for this very interesting discussion tonight, and bringing that, I think, to hopefully to the forefront of all of our attention and thought of it is something that we need to think about seriously. From a professional perspective, and on behalf of the UNB Faculty of Science, I'm very proud to have welcomed you back to UNB for this lecture to both our on and off-campus communities. At this time, I would like to call on Ms. Karen Taylor of the Chalmers Foundation and one of our science students, Ms. Miriam Ferron, to come to the stage for presentations.
I don't have as big hands. Okay. On behalf
of the Faculty of Science, UNB, and the Greater Fredericton community, I would like to thank you, Dr. Blackmer, for this really interesting presentation, which will have a significant impact on society as well as potentially many of us personally. As a modest token of our appreciation, I am pleased to present this donation to the Chalmers Foundation on your behalf.
On behalf of the Chalmers Hospital Foundation, I would like to thank UNB very much and Dr. Blackmer for a marvelous presentation, very thought-provoking, and for your generous gift to the foundation, which will go to support programs and enhance services at the Chalmers Hospital. So thank you again.
On a more personal note from the Faculty of Science, we would like you to accept this gift, which acknowledges your professional and academic ties with our faculty.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Later.
I trust that you are as proud of us as we are of you. Thank you again, and please visit us whenever you find yourself in Fredericton at home in the near future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam, and thank you, Karen. Thank you again, and please visit us whenever you're back in Fredericton, and so we can get together and have coffee and chat some more. I trust you have found this evening's public lecture to be informative, and we appreciate you taking the time to join us. If you know of someone who was unable to attend the evening, a video recording of Dr. Blackmer's lecture will be available in the near future, and you can certainly contact us to get access to that lecture. In closing, I would like to acknowledge our Science Student Leadership Program for their assistance in tonight's arrangement. So thank you to all the peer mentors for helping us this evening and helping everyone. I want to also thank Miriam, who is the president of the Health Sciences Society. I think that's right, isn't it? Yep. And for representing our student body in science for this presentation. I also want to thank Anna in Development and Donor Relations for partnering with us for the event and in helping make this happen. And I certainly would be remiss to not thank the individual who did most of the work in planning for this evening's activities, and that's my amazing administrative assistant, Ms. Patricia Douglas. So thank you, Patty, for everything that you've done. Finally, I can't express enough, how appreciative we are for Dr. Blackmer to have taken the time to come here and spend it with us this evening and give us this. Please, everyone, take care on your drive home, and good evening.